Hello, I'm Jan Oberg. I am the director and co-founder of the Transnational Foundation for Peace and Future Research in Lund, Sweden. And the task I've set myself here is to, the next roughly half an hour, to talk about China. Let me say that it's not because I'm a China expert in any way. I don't speak the language, I haven't been there much, and that's not what I've done in my life, but I know a little bit about conflicts and peacemaking and conflict analysis. And one of the reasons we should be interested in China is that it is the coming, if you will, number one nation on earth. Whether we like it or not, whether we know about it or not, things are happening. And the United States and the Western world is on its way down. It will not be a new empire, but it's a long story why. The Chinese are not interested in leading in the same way as the Americans have done since 1945. Now, I should also say that I work with China in a peace perspective, because I find bits and pieces of Chinese thinking conducive to peace, and I'll come back to that. And my own background is that I visited China in 1983 as part of a Danish cultural delegation. We traveled around for a little more than 2 weeks, were received everywhere, saw everything from party leadership to very poor peasants in the rice fields outside Chengdu. And for reasons, which is a long story, I did not get back to China before 2018. And in 2018, what I did was to travel around completely on my own, with no tourist guides, no plans. What I brought with me was a camera, and I'll come back to that because that's the other way apart from research in which I work with China. I work with China with a camera. And this means that I can see differences. The observations you do as a visitor, as a tourist, as a person who travels around. And what you see immediately is a totally amazing development from poverty, from dirt, from poor people everywhere, from bicycles everywhere at the time, from simple technologies to an advanced society with skyscrapers popping up, overnight everywhere, fascinating sometimes architecture. Very daring sculptural buildings. You see a way of life and a material standard which in some ways are way beyond many countries, way higher than in many countries in the West. You sit on trains which drive 310 kilometers an hour and very soon will be in the range of 600 kilometers an hour. And the Chinese have built an infrastructure over the last 30 years in which they have constructed more than 30,000 kilometers of high-speed rails. It's very quickly to get around, very efficient society, easy to take a plane. Everything is coordinated with the WeChat app, which is much more, it's Facebook and selling and contacting and chatting and planning and payment and everything in one. And I got fascinated by also the enormous hospitality, openness, and friendly attitude that the people, of course I met just a few out of 1,400 millions. But long story short, I made friends with many. I was invited home. People helped me to see things I'd like to see. I wanted to see, for instance, a silk factory in Hangzhou, and I met a family who said, we can call them and see whether they will show you around and things like that. It has been a lovely experience. I was not checked more than one time, and that was because there was a big fair when I returned to Shanghai, and they wanted to check whatever you had in your suitcase and things like that. And nobody asked me why I took pictures. Nobody approached me in any way. I was totally free to walk where I wanted, and I just giving this because there are so many stories about what you can and cannot do in China, completely on your own. And so I'd like to go into the other way in which I work with China, and that is as a photographer. Now I will move this one a little bit so you can see here. These are two pictures. You can actually even see me standing there in front of a large multi-media installation, which is about the East and the West, and what I'll come back to, and which is the center on what I'm going to talk about, the Belt and Road Initiative, or the new Silk Roads. But the installation, which was exhibited at the Venice Biennale in 2019, after I came home and had taken a lot of pictures from China, I could use these pictures in this installation. There are 4 panels going from China over Central Asia, Kazakhstan, etc., and Somalia, and God knows what places I've taken pictures, and then over to the West, the dark part of the installation behind myself, where I have pictures of the bad West, which is warfare, in this case pictures from Syria, and then also the good West, which is behind me here, pictures from Venice, the cultural, rich, generous West that has created so much useful stuff for the rest of the world. And what I'm trying to say in this one is, and I know it creates debate because I talked with 1,500 people in front of that one over 6 months in 2019, is the world is changing. It's changing from the West to the East, from the Occident to the Orient. It is changing from darker period where we are at the moment and becoming much more, if you will, potentially positive, with a multipolar world in which the United States and the Western world and NATO will be one, but not the only one and not the one that dominates. So my approach to China is research, visits, dialogues, and it is art, and I hope to spend time in the future in China doing art together with Chinese artists too. So you see, you can try to discuss these things with many media, and I find art and research a very good combination. I recommend it to those who have some talent in both fields. I should say also, by way of this long introduction, that China is like any other society, a society with good sides and not so good sides. It's subjectively what we like and what we don't like. This is not a hallelujah, everything is great in China. What it is, and what I insist to do and say is, we should be curious about China. It is very impressive what the Chinese people have done over just 30, 40 years. It's never been done to that extent in human history. For instance, uplifting 700 million people out of poverty. There are no poor people. There are people with very little, but there's no poor, suffering poor people in China anymore. They had a plan for that should have ended this year, but they achieved that goal last year. Nobody in the West was interested. Whereas we in the West have had a couple of 100 years to eradicate poverty. You still have the world's richest, biggest economy, the United States, where 25% of the people are living under the poverty line. So I would say if China is achieving this much infrastructure, welfare state, cohesion, much better material living, enormous expansion of the cultural sector. Shanghai will be the future of the world's artists and culture. 700 people lifted out of poverty. We should be curious. We should not judge before we know. And coming to know, I would just say, do not believe that you can understand China by means of Western concepts, Western ways of thinking. If you apply Western human rights to China, yes, there are problems. By the way, so there is in the Western, with the American policy having killed millions of people in the name of fighting terrorism and all that, or killed, or at least killed and wounded and made life impossible for millions of people in the Middle Eastern countries. What I'm saying is, study China on its own premises. To them, it's democracy. To them, they have human rights. To them, they have a completely different idea about what society is and should be, and how different economies can be combined. Why a one-party system with some 6 or 7 supplementary accepted parties, is not a one-party system, is what they think is the most efficient, and why they think that way. And why it's interesting for you to think of the fact, I believe, that we call this many in the West call this a one-man dictatorship. Please understand that the party, the Communist Chinese Party, has 95 million members. Now, it's not exactly a one-man system. And by the way, by the 1st of July this year, this party celebrated its 100th anniversary as the second largest party in the world. So I would say be a little humble, dear Western thinkers and journalists and politicians. Try to understand before you condemn, judge, and whatever else you do at the moment. And this is the situation we're in. Everything you hear in the Western world, Western mainstream media, is negative about China. That is not fair. That is not fair. Now let me come to the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. What is that? That is an initiative that the Chinese President Xi Jinping presented in Kazakhstan, Astana, the new capital of Kazakhstan, in 2013, 8 years ago. And he said that China was willing to set off $1,000 billion. $1,000 billion to create new Silk Roads from China to principally everywhere in the world. The idea being building railroads, harbors, infrastructure facilities, digital highways, to connect the East and the West with each other as fast as possible. Of course, to bring Chinese goods and people over to the West, but also to get it the other way as fast as possible, probably in the future in high-speed trains, because car driving is not going to be the future of the world. It's only the Americans and the Danes and a few other people who have not followed their last 60 years development who think that the car can be our main transport and trucks can be main transport of goods instead of high-speed trains. So that was the idea of dragging in as many countries as possible in a cooperative effort. The Belt and Road Initiative. It's called BELT because that has to do with harbors, and road, of course, building high roads and things like that, trails, is to connect countries. The philosophy behind it being one that I respect and think is viable as a peace researcher, namely, if we connect people, make them mutually dependent in some kind of mutually beneficial ways, building fast transport, getting goods back and forth, educating children and youth and students in our different countries, etc. When we tie each other together, we reduce the risk of warfare, the risk of misunderstanding each other, because the more people we know, the more we work with them every day, the better the chance that we get to know them, respect them, make friends with them, and therefore make it more difficult to start killing them. let me say in parentheses here, these are the ideals. I'm giving you the model. I'm giving you the principles of it. I'm not saying that it works that way in all kinds of ways. And I'm not sitting here saying I know what that will look like in 20 years from now. But I'll give you a couple of arguments later for why I don't think the Chinese will build imperialism or colonialism in a new way, and they will not have a global empire. So this is today, 8 years later, a project that involves, in different big and small ways, but countries that have written a so-called memorandum of understanding with China, 140 countries of the world's 193 countries. It's all over Asia, it's the Middle East, it's parts of Africa, it's parts of Latin America. It is a number of countries in Western and Eastern Europe. And the Chinese philosophy is everyone who wants to contribute and work with us and work with the rest of the 140 are welcome as participants. It's not excluding the United States or anybody else. But the United States, Canada, and others do not want to work with this project. And they've been upset, for instance, when Italy was the first one. I think Italy and Greece were the first ones in the European Union and as NATO members who started working with China, and they were told, don't do that. So this is the idea that we should connect cultures, we should get to know each other, and we should have practical, tangible projects such as building schools or infrastructure, electricity systems, digital highways or whatever, and that will be mutually benefit. The Chinese term for it is win-win. And the idea is ideally that it would be 50-50. China would win, the other countries would win, and the country that it takes place in would win too, which is fundamentally different from Western exploitative colonialism and imperialism, where you always drag much more out of the place than you give. That's why the West has become so rich also, not only because of that, but that has been a mechanism. We take something and give them less back. Whereas the Chinese are saying it should be as fair as possible. Now, you will find lots of articles in the Western world and scholars and others who would say it is not always that. The Chinese are making the participating countries dependent in terms of debts that must be repaid. And if the country, a little poor country somewhere, cannot pay for a harbor or whatever, then the Chinese take over that harbor. I mean, there is always, in such gigantic projects, there is always a discrepancy between reality and the ideal. But what I am saying is this project has a very important cooperative peacemaking potential if it doesn't degenerate into something traditional, bad for the participating countries, but then they probably will drop out also. So there's a philosophy of harmony, which is also a very basic philosophy inside China. Harmony among the groups, harmony politically before we go. But there is also a long-term vision, something the Western world does not have anymore. The Belt and Road Initiative is something that has been started 8 years ago with the long-range idea of simply creating a new world order, new way of doing things together in our global community, if we could call it community, but the global society. So you can ask yourself, of course, $1,000 billion, the Chinese wants to get something back for that. Yes, of course, because China, for its development, needs cooperation with other countries, including the West, getting various types of technologies, selling its product, etc. And it says, better if we can do that quickly and in a cooperative way and not just pay each other and then have slow transports between each other. Or destroying nature by having low quality, old-fashioned technology transporting these things. So $1,000 billion is a lot of money, and in another this is a starting capital, if you will. Then the countries, of course, come in with it. So we're talking about, I don't know how much, but we're talking about much more than $1,000 billion. But $1,000 billion is about half of what the world spends together, all countries spend together on the military, on armament every year. So, what I want you to think of is how much good could the world construct, cooperate, create together if it disarmed or reduced its armament. Imagine that instead of $2,000 billion every year, the world's country would say, we will only use half of that. And everybody would be equally sure, or safe and secure, relatively speaking, but they would just be it on half the size. And then said, we will spend 1,000 we have saved on military, we will spend that on constructive projects, solving the energy problems, the environmental problems, climate change, all that, solve the poverty problem and all that. They could still have a military, and they could also solve the world's problems, at least if the political will was there, the money would be there. So in that sense, $1,000 billion is relatively little, but the Chinese have been smart enough to see we can do a lot of useful things. We can get a lot of goodwill in the world by plowing $1,000 billion into a cooperative project. And let me add, this is humanity's ever largest cooperative project. The Belt and Road Initiative, the new Silk Roads. And now you can reflect. How much have you heard about this project the last 8 years? I don't know where you come from. Of course, you may have heard a lot about it in some countries. But if you live in the United States, you live in Western Europe, you will have heard virtually nothing about it. There's a reason for that. It's considered threatening. It's considered threatening, and I will now come to why it is, but before I do, I'll just say one thing, which I hinted before. I do not think the Chinese will make a new imperialist system. I don't think they will start an America-like empire and try to dominate the world. There are a couple of reasons for that. The first thing is it would be a stupid project. There is nobody, no country anywhere in the world who can now say our model should be the leading and only one, everybody should have it, we should universalize our own system, and everybody should be like us. That's a fundamentally missionary, for the Western world, Christian idea. And those days are over when the world, if they ever existed, where the world could be ruled according to the same values everywhere. We are different and we should be different. We'll have to find ways in which we can have global governance, not government, governance in diversity, unity in diversity, not in uniformity. Secondly, the Chinese do not come with a Bible, as the West always did. It does not come and ask everybody to be Confucianists or Buddhists or think like the Chinese or have one-party system or do regime change or things like that. They simply say, can we cooperate? We don't want to change you, and you should not try to change us Chinese either. But can we cooperate? Can we build something that is a mutual benefit? We have some money, we have some technology, you have some of this and that. Can we do something together? Synergy. And secondly, the Chinese don't come with a sword. It is not that if you don't cooperate with us the way we want, we will start a war on you, or we will change your regime, or we will install our system or our ways of thinking with violent means, like the West has tried in, Afghanistan, Iraq. You mention anything down there, and you will see these attempts to change them. Everybody must have a neoliberal economy, privatization. What was done to Yugoslavia 20 years ago was catastrophe, like it has been everywhere else. You cannot export systems unless they are receptive in the receiving end, so to speak. You can't do that with the military interventions and occupations. So I think that these are the three reasons, and I have a fourth reason. The Chinese do not want us to be like them. They want to be special. The Western Christian idea of mission is you should go out in the world and make everybody, not only our disciples, but also our Coca-Cola drinkers. That's not the idea of the Chinese thinking. The Chinese would not like you and me to try to become Chinese. They are too special. They are too like the Japanese. They do not want you to come too close. It's fine if you can speak some language, and of course it's okay if you can speak Chinese. But there will come a time when you will then be corrected that this little way you expressed it was not quite okay. So there's this, don't get too close. You will never be like us. And so if you have that attitude, you're of course very proud of yourself. You're very defensive. You're very strong. You don't want anybody to touch you. But you also do not try to impose your own Chinese-ness on everybody else. That is why China has only one military base around the world, in Djibouti. Only one base. The American Empire has 630 military bases. That alone is a reason why the Americans will not survive. The paying for these things are impossible in the long run, particularly when the economy is going down. My third point is this, and I'm now leaving China a little bit, but only indirectly touching upon it. The response in the West to China's development the last 30, 40 years, eradication of poverty and all these things I've said, and to the Belt and Road Initiative is non-interest. Turning into basically a negative attitude to China, which I do not think is fair, as I said. No matter the criticism you may legitimately have of China, this is not acceptable. China is interesting, and China is part of our future, and there's no way you and I can live the next 50, 100 years without being influenced by China. Forget it. And therefore it's utterly stupid not to be interested. Doesn't mean that we should buy it. We should be knowing about it, and we should certainly not judge it before we know something about it. So what is being built now, and my foundation is going to publish a second report about that in a few weeks' time, is what we call the China Cold War Agenda, CCWA. It's a very systematic effort led by America, politically, media-wise, psychologically, and in terms of laws, to secure that the next, God knows how many decades, you will have a confrontational Cold War relationship with China, not cooperate with it. I cannot go into all the details of this. It has to do with a series of accusations such as there's a genocide in Xinjiang, such as they are going to swallow Taiwan militarily, such as it's a dictatorship, such as it's a surveillance society, such as it's not a democracy, it doesn't have parliaments with multi-party systems like us, so therefore it's bad. So this accusation industry is what you will see in your Western media. It's always negative. There's not a word about having uplifted 700 million people out of poverty or how they did it. These things are dangerous, and they are played out through the media. Mainstream media today cannot write positive things or be just curious or interestingly report on it, unless perhaps it's some kind of space exploration or something, cozy happening somewhere. But politically, economically, culturally, etc., there's no interest in the Western press. And I can tell you one reason is that the press is controlled by those who run politics, indirectly and directly. You may not be aware of it, but there's a new law passed by the United States, S-1169. S-1169 is a law that is called the China Competition Law, and it gives you over hundreds of pages all the areas where the US shall construct its policies in such a way that it can only be out-competing China, not cooperating with China. One of the provisions, notice this very clearly, is the setting off of $300 million each year the next 5 years, that is $1.5 billion, to train journalists, influence media, to write only negatively about China and its Belt and Road Initiative that I just told you about. You may think I'm inventing this. I am not. You just search, and don't use Google, please, because Google is checking everything you do and reporting also, and deranking controversial non-mainstream sites like my own foundations. Deranking is a way of censorship. Act S1169, China Competition Act. You can read it yourself. It's very clear. You can find it on our webpage also at https://transnational.live. That means the end of the free media in the US and elsewhere if they practice this also with, let's say, European media, Denmark's broadcasting system, which I expect they do or will do. And so what is happening in this destructive process of fighting China is that we undermine our own identity. A fine thing in the West has always been that media were so-called free. Not always free, but you and I could write, we could speak up, we could do what we wanted. There were journalists who had wide, differently backgrounds who would give different perspectives on things like Iraq, Syria, Yugoslavia, or whatever. This is all gone. The intention is to unify into one narrative what China is about, and it's about something that is only bad. And that's because you're weak yourself. The United States today is a grumpy old patriarch who cannot get his family on his deathbed to listen to what he says, and who does not understand the world and does not understand that his advice or his attempt to bully will not go home, will not be accepted any longer. And that is very sad for the United States. I've never been anti-American, and we are writing our report with sorrow, because in this stupid fight, in this stupid choice, the United States is choosing a Cold War that will destroy itself, economically, in terms of legitimacy, and in terms of some of the finest values that used to be American values, such as freedom of the press. There's now a lot of state-controlled media in the United States, such as also Radio Free Europe and Radio Free Asia. Not at all free. They are supposed to serve and broadcast and be advocating within the framework of US foreign policy. It's as state-controlled as Chinese media. Of course, not all of them, but that shape, that part will be as state-controlled, Washington-controlled, as anybody we accuse of being state-controlled media. And then you have a psychological interpretation. The time is over when we can understand the world with political science and international law and international relations at our universities and all that. If that is relevant anymore, you also have to add to them psychopolitical disorder, psychopolitical projection. When somebody is in deep crisis, we can turn to the Freudian concept of projection. When I don't feel good and I know I'm doing something bad, I try to project that over on somebody else and say, look how bad they are. You saw Biden say that at the Geneva press conference after his meeting with Putin a couple of weeks ago. And he was asked by only American journalists, he did not want anybody else to be there. But do you think that your meeting with Putin will imply that he now is more careful with his policies and don't do bad things like Putin always does? And then Biden says, it's not what I have told him or our meeting. He will know that if he does bad things, let's say such as Ukraine or Crimea, he will lose legitimacy in the world. Because then he adds, imagine the United States would interfere in elections around the world, and the world would know it. Then we would also lose legitimacy for the United States in the world. This man is projecting, and he's denying that the dark side called interventionism and regime change exists as a fundamental policy element in the United States foreign policy. Since between 1945 and 2000, the United States has regime changed in other countries 81 times. China has not done it anywhere. So you see, what I'm getting at is you need some psychoanalysis to understand what is happening to the grumpy old patriarch. And the grumpy old patriarch hates to see that somebody has a new socioeconomic model, somebody has succeeded with what he has not succeeded with, and that is China, and therefore China must be kept down. It must almost be denied that China could be an interesting partner to work with. Fact is that the United States does work with China. My fear is that will be less and less so in the future. China will learn, and that's part of its new 5-year plan, to do more on its own without being dependent on the West. But I assure you, the West will be dependent on the future, high-tech, innovative China that is roaring ahead also after its COVID handling, where there's basically no COVID. COVID is behind China now. So I'm advising you, be curious, learn about China, go to China, make Chinese friends, and judge for yourself. But do not listen to what you hear in the Western mainstream media and politics. That, I can tell you, is not the truth, and it's not fair. And we are building a new and more interesting multipolar world where the United States will be one important country and the West will be important civilization, but not the only one. And I hope we'll get there without destroying the world first. And when we do that, then we can also solve the problems that are the problems of humanity, such as climate change, poverty, reducing militarism, abolishing the warfare as an accepted social behavior, etc. But we can't get there with a Cold War that the US wants on China and that China does not want back again on the US. We cannot spend the resources, the intellectual, the physical, the psychological, the economic resources on yet another Cold War, because that will destroy the possibility for all humanity to get our problems solved. We do not have one day to waste on cold or warm wars. And that will be your future too, listening to this little lecture. And I thank you very much for your attention.